Yeah, so I'm Greg Sadler, the CEO of Good Ancestors Policy. I'm also the Secretary of Effective Altruism Australia here at the EAGX in Melbourne. So your question was, what do I think about effective policy advocacy? So I guess what we're trying to do at Good Ancestors Policy is help members of communities in Australia advocate for the positions that they think are really important and the policies that they value the most. So it can be hard to use democracy in the way that it's intended to be used as people who are less familiar with government and less familiar with how policy systems work. And I think it's unfair sometimes that younger people or people without the right expertise don't get to have as much say in democracy as people who work for big lobbies or maybe older people who have more money and more interests. So one of the things that we're trying to do at Good Ancestors Project is make sure that people who care about future generations and care about maximising the amount of good that they can do have an effective voice in the Australian policy conversation on the really big topics. Yeah, so Good Ancestors Project has just turned a year old, so making it through your first year as a small startup is really exciting. And I think in terms of the amount of impact that we've managed to achieve, our first year has been much better than I'd hoped it would be. So getting change in politics can be slow and difficult, and we'd gone in with relatively humble expectations about what we were going to be able to achieve. But we've done all kinds of things in our first year. So we've had conversations with emergency management agencies about how they can think in a more evidence-based way about risks that are perhaps lower likelihood than other risks, but so much more consequential. So we think it's important for Australia to work to prepare for catastrophic disasters large volcanic eruptions or solar storms or even nuclear war. Because although those events are unlikely, the harm is so large that it's worth worrying about them. And we think that if Australia could do things like have plans for those kinds of disasters, or even spend some of what's some of the grant funding available in various programs to plan for those kinds of disasters, the positive impact could be very large. We've done work on philanthropy reform. So currently it's the case that many of Australia's most impactful charities don't have access to tax deductible status for the work that they do. So one example of that is ICANN. So ICANN is working to abolish nuclear weapons and thus eliminate the risk of there being a nuclear war. And they've received a Nobel Peace Prize for their work, but they don't currently have the ability in Australia to take deductions that can be tax deductible for the donors. And that really hurts their ability to raise funds in Australia. And it's honestly kind of bizarre that a charity that has received the highest recognition a charity can receive, or even any organisation can receive for doing good work, doesn't have this status. Whereas, for instance, an organisation that works in a small town to repair their local war memorial does have that charitable status, but people trying to prevent a nuclear holocaust don't. So I think that government has the policy setting wrong on that issue, and we've been able to talk to the Productivity Commission, which is inquiring to that question, and explain to them why that current setting's wrong and how changing it could make such a big difference. Yeah, so I read Peter Singer when I was at university, which I suspect is how a lot of people got into the effective altruism movement. I think when I was a university student, I liked being quite contrarian and finding ways to disagree with things. And so I read Peter Singer. I'm I want this to be wrong, but I don't really know how it's wrong. And buried it deep in my heart and tried not to think about it too much. And I think many years later, I was probably listening to maybe a Sam Harris podcast, which was talking about these same ideas. And maybe again had that same feeling of these ideas sound clear and rational, and the arguments are compelling. I can't think about why they're wrong, and maybe I don't want to commit that they're right, but as someone who thinks of myself as being a rational person, maybe I need to concede on this. So I went onto the Effective Altruism Australia website and set up my recurring monthly donation and thought, they got me on that one, and then just set and forget that for years, and just didn't thought okay, I'm discharging my moral duties here to this compelling argument. And then quite a while later received an email from the monthly email from Effective Altruism Australia saying that they were after board members. So having seen that email, I'd been working a lot with corporate boards in my job at the time, and I thought like, hey, like I know how boards work, like I've got these sort of like legal and governance skills that I could contribute. Like I don't think that they would accept my application, but I may as well apply, and was excited to learn that the board was like really interested in my application, and ultimately took me on to be the secretary of the charity. And I think that that was kind of like the first step to falling further down the effective altruism rabbit hole. And I actually hadn't gone to any community events with effective altruists even up to that point, and I spent like several years volunteering as the secretary of Effective Altruism Australia, still having like, this was over the COVID period, having never met like another member of the effective altruism community in person. And then it was only at the conference in Canberra about a year ago, which was like the first time I'd ever gone to an EA event. And then you'd asked about like how Good Ancestors got started. So one of the things that we did at that event was like a sort of ideas competition. So we sat around tables and we thought like, if you could do like one sort of moonshot in effective altruism, like what would it be? And our table put forward the idea of a Australian-based policy advocacy organisation that would take like the great ideas that are coming out of this community and present them to government. And ultimately we kind of, each table got up and pitched their idea to the room, and then we voted and we kind of agreed that like the best thing that we could come up with this room is the idea of a policy advocacy organisation. I thought, well, if someone's going to do this, like it's going to be me that's doing it. So I did. So that kind of like idea that came out of like a casual conversation in a conference turned into an organisation I've been running for the last year. I guess our experience has been that public servants in Australia often do think about the longer term, and they do think about evidence-based policy, but they're often like really capacity constrained. Like they want to sort of do this research and think about it in these ways, but they can kind of find it like just logistically difficult. So they've been like quite excited when we've come to public servants and said like, we think the issues we're working on are really important. Like, you know, we're a charity, we're not sort of funded by some for-profit advocacy, like we don't really have a dog in this fight other than doing the best we can for the Australian people. And like in that constant, here's some research and here's some arguments that it's valuable for you to think about. And the public servants have been really keen on that. But the overall system of public service and like government in Australia has like quite a lot of inertia in it. And so sort of actually getting change in that larger system can be like difficult and slow. So I'm kind of hoping that like persistence is a virtue here, and when we've engaged, we've had sort of like incremental change. So we've had like meaningful successes, but I think that we haven't kind of like revolutionized Australia in 1 year, right? And I think that that's to be expected. But I think if we can like remain persistent and keep building on incremental changes, like we can have like really meaningful change in the long run. I think one of the challenges that we face like in the EA community is really like a funding challenge. So we're kind of new, we have like good impact, like we can just demonstrate in our first year, but it's still only like a 1 year of impact track record. So, you know, we can't like be a GiveWell top charity yet. We just don't have the history to do that. So we're really relying on small donors in Australia to sort of keep us going to develop that track record. But I think it can be challenging for donors because people want to spend their money in the most impactful way. They want to make their donations in the most impactful way. And on one hand, you've got these sort of like gold, like blue chip GiveWell charities who have this amazing track record, and then you've got us who's kind of like a riskier bet, I guess. And so trying to like persuade people that they should have a risky bet in their personal philanthropy can be hard. I mean, the main thing that we're doing at Good Ancestors is helping community groups that are running policy advocacy events, right? So we want to come to your community group. We can come with materials, we can talk to you about the opportunity, why it can be impactful, and the kinds of arguments that you could make to make a difference in that cause. And we can, like, maybe you're not an expert in that cause, but we can help explain it. And like, maybe you don't know the best ways to talk to government, but like we can talk you through like how to write that and what kind of arguments might be useful. So if you're wondering how you can help, by being in touch with your group, your sort of like local EA group, whether that's at university or a city level, and being on the lookout for Good Ancestors policy events and coming along to them is really great. Another thing that you can do if you'd like to be more engaged is join the Australian EA's Slack. I'm on that Slack most days, talking about the ideas that I'm working on and what's happening in policy in Australia. And there might be ways that you can kind of like share your views on the sort of the documents and arguments that I'm developing, or even contribute some thoughts to that. And then like the third way that you could help is by donating to keep this charity afloat. And I think that any of those three ways like really helps the work that we're doing. The incoming government made this commitment to try and double the amount that Australians donate to charities because they want to see like more Australian contribution to the not-for-profit space, which is a really exciting commitment. Like doubling the amount of philanthropy in Australia would really change how the landscape works. So it can be surprising that Australians currently donate much less to charity than you might think. So I think Australians donate to charity roughly half of what the Kiwis do over the ditch, which is like a surprising fact. So I think it's good that government's trying to like double philanthropic giving. So when we're talking to government, we're trying to suggest ways that those changes could be made, which encourage more giving, but also grow the impact of giving. So thinking of animals, one of the things that frustrates me currently is that an animal welfare charity can only have tax-deductible status if they work like directly to help sick and injured wildlife. Whereas if you're a charity that's trying to make structural changes that impact, thousands or millions of farmed animals, you don't get access to that tax-deductible status. So the most impactful way of doing animal welfare is excluded from the most powerful way to raise funds. And I think that's really damaging to the ability of the not-for-profit sector to like help animals in a really impactful way. So we're asking government to change the way that rule works so that highly impactful animal advocacy organisations can have access to that tax-deductible status. And this is also what we're trying to do on catastrophic disasters. So ICANN, which received the Nobel Prize for its effort to abolish nuclear weapons, it also doesn't have access to this ability to take a tax-deductible donation, which again limits its ability to raise funds and it limits its ability to have impact. So we think if the government expanded these tax-deductible donations to more high-impact cause areas, that would firstly allow us to donate more money. It would allow us to donate more money to more impactful causes. So it would help government deliver its commitment to double philanthropic giving, but it could also dramatically impact the positive outcome that the sector achieves. Yeah, so Australia has this thing called the Disaster Ready Fund, which is a $5 billion bank account that government's hoping to pay at a rate of $200 million a year to prepare for disasters. So we talked to government when it was designing that fund and suggested that that fund should include in its scope the ability to prepare for catastrophic disasters, because although catastrophic disasters are less likely, they can be orders of magnitude more consequential than regular disasters. And it was great that government did change the way that fund was designed so that it does explicitly say that catastrophic disasters are covered. But in the first year of distributions, they made about $200 million in grants, but not a single dollar of those grants went to catastrophic disasters. And I think it's right that government worries about bushfires and floods and storms that we experience every year, and it should be working to mitigate those risks. But some portion of that funding should also be going to catastrophic risks. So we know, for instance, that a large volcanic eruption could damage Australia's food supply and cause like famine in Australia or potentially famine in our region, and having like a plan for what that would mean and how we could maintain Australia's food production or even expand Australia's food production during that kind of disaster to make sure Australians are fed and to sort of like provide humanitarian benefit in our region could be enormously impactful. And like the cost of that kind of work is really marginal, right? So building like a single flood levy tends to cost about $200 million, whereas having writing a plan for these kinds of catastrophic disasters and then like regularly exercising that plan is likely to cost only $1 or $2 million. So for like 1% of the price of a single flood levy, you could be much better positioned on a catastrophic disaster, but regrettably government didn't make any grants of this kind. So this was the thing that we were talking about government when they were designing the fund, and we're continuing to talk about government as it runs the fund and as it develops other capabilities for disasters to also think about lower likelihood but much higher consequence events. Government can be very focused on the kinds of events that happen every year because that's the events that are in our mind as like members of the public. That's what we experience. Often the senior managers in these emergency management organisations kind of got into those positions because they did a very good job responding to fires and floods. So those are the issues that are on their mind. And I think that they can just underestimate how likely these catastrophic disasters could be. So I remember a conversation with some emergency managers where we were saying that the chance of a nuclear war is forecast by some experts as 1 in 1,000 per year or 1 in 100 per year, and that the UK's recently published national risk assessment puts that risk at between like 1% and 5% per year. And you could see the shock in their faces that that estimate was like orders of magnitude more than what they thought it was. So I think often government imagines these unlikely risks are basically impossible risks and they don't need to worry about them. But I think like COVID proved that wrong. Like government pretended, or at least it sort of, a lot of officials said that it was an unprecedented pandemic, whereas I think anyone who's read a history book knows that it wasn't an unprecedented pandemic. And I think that that's the way that government also thinks about like large volcanic eruptions or nuclear wars, other kinds of catastrophic disasters, that they're unlikely, so they're impossible. And I think that this is like an error. With AI sort of leaping into public consciousness with ChatGPT 3.5 and GPT-4, government has started to ask views from the public about what it should be doing about AI, which is really good. I mean, it's right that government should seek the views of the public on the risks of AI and how it can be made safe and responsible. But something that was regrettable, like in the framing of government's consultation and the framing of the sort of expert reports that underpinned it, was that it essentially dismissed the possibility of catastrophic and existential risks from AI. So government's position seemed to be that AI presents an enormous economic opportunity, and AI has some ethical issues that we need to navigate, and we need to navigate those issues so that we can realize that full economic potential, and it wants to build a strategy that achieves that. And what we were trying to tell government is, yes, there are these ethical concerns that are immediate term and they're real, and it absolutely should be working to address them. Like, we don't want to have sexist and racist and biased AIs operating in Australia, and that needs to be addressed. And we also think government should work to address these misuse and dual use risks. So there's AIs that could help people design bioweapons, or AIs that could produce bulk misinformation and disinformation and deep fakes that could like disrupt our elections. And these risks are also upon us, right? Like, we're starting to see this now, and they're going to get bad in the next couple of years, and government should be taking action to address those risks now. And a lot of leading experts think that in addition to these present risks that we should tackle and these misuse risks that we should tackle, that there's also this potential for future existential risks. As AI systems become more powerful, they could become more dangerous, and we just can't be certain that they'll be safe. So our argument is that it's the responsibility of government to take the precautionary principle here and make sure that it's funding the AI safety research necessary and taking like the other regulatory steps necessary to remove that possibility from the future. Like, if government wants to have the economic success of AI, it should do the work necessary to make sure that there is no existential risk before that it sort of follows that path too far. We've got to think a little bit about what is this idea of an existential risk, and how do you talk about this in a balanced way that doesn't sort of amount to being alarmist or panicked or a doomer about these issues. And I think it's important to just like be honest that there's a huge amount of uncertainty here. We don't know what an AI that is highly intelligent would look like. And I think that it's easy to anthropomorphize here and sort of pretend that a hyper-intelligent AI is like a human but much smarter. But like, I don't think that we necessarily know that that's what AI intelligence will look like. It could be something like very different to what we expect. It could be something that's like much smarter than us in some ways, but less smart than us in other ways. Like, it's just sort of hard to forecast. So like, given that uncertainty and given the possibility that we don't know what it would be like to sort of like coexist with like a hyper capable AI, it's right for us to be cautious about what that future could look like. At the opening of this conference, Andrew Lee compared it to how humans might interact with insects. So it's not that we're necessarily malevolent towards insects, but if we're building a highway, or even if we're driving to work, like, we don't think too hard about whether or not we might run over an insect on the way to work. And like, it's conceivable that hyper-intelligent and hyper-capable AIs aren't malevolent towards us, but they just sort of don't act with much regard to us in the same way that we don't often act with much regard to insects. And that could go really badly for humanity. So yeah, we don't really know what catastrophic risk would look like, but it could be really bad for the human race. And I think it makes sense that we do the work necessary to make sure that AI is like understandable, that we can like see what it's doing and we can interpret what it's doing, that we can kind of like provide ongoing assurance that like, if we think we know what it's doing now, can we continue to understand what it's doing as it evolves or changes? I mean, even with AIs that we've seen deployed already they've sort of had new capabilities that seem to emerge as we get better at like prompting them and using them. So this sort of idea of like ongoing monitoring of AIs to make sure that they don't start doing things that are unpredictable is important. And I guess something that I'd be like really keen to communicate is that these sorts of efforts don't really split the difference between present concerns and these misuse concerns and these existential concerns. So if you're doing the work necessary to like understand why an AI is doing what it's doing and to make sure that it's aligned with our values, that helps address the racist and sexist AIs of today. And it will also help address potentially dangerous AIs that might be interfering with our elections or producing weapons. And it will also help with potential existential risks in the future. So investment in just like the AI research necessary to understand these tools is really important for government to do. So a few ideas on AI governance. So the first one would be just the idea of acknowledging that these risks are possible. So currently in the messaging from the Australian government, it's sort of been a denial phase about the possibility of existential and catastrophic risks. And so we, like a first and like a necessary first step would be saying, yeah, like we've read the Future of Life Institute letter. We've heard these calls from experts. We've seen the polling from people who are working these technologies that they're concerned about that risk. And we think that that's valid, and we think that it's right to make sure that that risk is understood and addressed. So acknowledging the problem is the first step to addressing the problem. Another thing is that like Australia has an important voice on the international stage that can be a significant voice in things like international treaty. So like if other countries are talking about developing a treaty on AI, how we contribute to that conversation, and whether that's in a positive way or in a way that says that this treaty doesn't seem important matters. So like we'd love to see Australia entering into those treaty negotiations saying, yes, we Australia want to be the kind of country that addresses both the near-term and the long-term risks of AI through international governance. And there's also sort of small things, right? So we have Australian representatives on international standards development organisations that kind of like develop the technical standards for how things work. And we'd love to see government, when it's instructing those negotiators to go to those standards negotiations, to say, you should be thinking about this AI being efficient, and you should be thinking about it being effective, and you should be thinking about it pursuing economic goals, but you should also be putting guidance into those standards that make it safe and interpretable and align with our values. Another idea in that space that I think is important is we're seeing a lot of countries and regions pursuing various kinds of AI safety labs. So this is the idea of sort of like putting funding and expertise into a body, people who have the capability to kind of look inside the black box of an AI and try and understand how it works, and also provide that sort of ongoing assurance that if it's safe now, like does it remain safe into the future? So the EU has developed a lab like this. Singapore has a national lab of this kind, and we think it would be a really powerful thing for Australia to develop a national lab, or even to coordinate like in our region, have a sort of an Asia Pacific AI safety lab. Currently we do this with cars, so we cooperate with New Zealand on a lab that assesses the safety of cars, so that when we're driving around in Australia, like we know that our cars have the crumple zones that they need and the airbags that they need, and that's an international measure with a sort of a lab that coordinates internationally. And so that same kind of idea for AI, I think is like powerful and a reasonable thing for us as the public to expect government to do. My theory is that we as a community can use democracy the way that it's meant to be used, and I think there's three elements to that. So the first element is developing really robust evidence-based policy proposals that have like a high impact. And I think members of the EA community are already doing all kinds of research into the biggest problems that we're facing and how that they could be addressed. So one of the things that I work to do is to take those policies that are being developed globally, like policies about pandemics or AI safety or other issues, and help to translate those into the Australian context. So what do they mean for Australian governments? What do they mean for Australian legislation? But just having a good idea isn't enough. So I can also take those ideas and talk to like decision makers about them. So I can talk to public servants, or I can talk to elected officials about those ideas. But ultimately those elected officials, you know, they care about good arguments, but they also care about the views of the public, right? Like they're operating in a democracy, so they care about what their electorate thinks. So the absolutely essential third component is this ability to raise our voice in the public about things that we care about. So like if we expect the Australian government to work harder on pandemic prevention, I can have great arguments about why pandemic prevention is important, and I can talk to public servants and ministers about why pandemic prevention can be achieved. But we need voices from the Australian public that support those other two ways of seeking a change and sort of like call for action. So I think the way we ultimately achieve policy change is by bringing those three things together in one place, which is evidence-based policy, the kind of direct engagement that I can do with decision makers, but also people in Australia like raising their voice behind these important issues and presenting the same kinds of arguments in the media, directly in consultation with their representatives or by responding to public submissions to say that these are issues that are really important to them. I guess like another way to think about it is, as a person, you have political capital and you don't just have to wait for an election to spend that political capital. All kinds of other Australians are talking to their representatives about the issues that they care year round, and we can do that as well. So one of the things that's been most exciting coming to this conference is just how many people have been excited about policy and the ability to do policy advocacy. So at the last EAGX in Canberra over a year ago, policy was almost seen as like a niche idea. Like it was just sort of like one of those also-ran topics that was discussed in the margins at some sessions. But it's just been so exciting at this conference to see so many people interested in policy and interested in the way that we as a community can just like ask for and advocate for the things that we think would make a tremendous difference. And that energy in the community has like completely changed my views and made me like so much more optimistic about our ability and a kind of like the impact that we can have by asking governments to do the things that we think are important.